Women and the world can no longer afford to wait for equality. This session aims to help cultivate a revolutionary dialogue to build society back better and achieve systemic change.
Welcome, and thank you to our distinguished speakers and also the audience for joining women political leaders at the 2020 virtual SDG Action Zone to engage in this important and timely conversation. The COVID-19 pandemic has presented all of us with a very clear choice. Well, either we take the time to make a really big step forward and accelerate change, or we risk losing the progress that has been made, especially in the area of equality between women and men in leadership. COVID-19 data shows that countries that are led by women do relatively better in the crisis. So how does this influence perceptions of women as leaders? Today, our conversation will focus on how to use data, how to use evidence, and also look at concrete examples of women's leadership to get rid of wrong and harmful stereotypes. Our session also wants to encourage an essential dialogue and to mobilize women and men, girls and boys to be part of this change and build back better. I've got an absolutely stellar group of speakers here. It's a wonderful alignment, and I'm very confident we'll have a super interesting conversation. And let me start with Michelle Harrison, Dr. Michelle Harrison, who is the Global CEO of the WP Government Practice and Global CEO of the Public Division of Kantar. Now, Kantar and women political leaders launched together the Reykjavik Index for Leadership in November 2018, with an update every year, which is there to support the journey towards equality between women and men. We want to measure the perceptions on the suitability of leadership of both women and men in different professions around 22 different sectors. And so the index gives a really good spotlight into what do people think and feel about having a woman or a man as a leader in a specific job. So Michelle, let me ask you, why is it actually so important to measure perceptions and to challenge perceptions? How does that really influence an increase of women's access to leadership?
Thank you, Silvana. So we set up the Reykjavik Index a few years ago because of our belief in evidence-based public policy making. So if we want to hold ourselves accountable to the interventions that we're making to try and drive forward equality between men and women, then the most important thing is that we start with a baseline so that we can track that progress over time. And so what the Reykjavik Index does is provide that evidence base and allows us to track how things are going. I think when it comes though specifically to this index, it was also focused on getting us some evidence in a very specific area. This area, as you mentioned, perception. There are a lot of great evidence bases out there that look at the outcomes for women, particularly in economic outcomes or health outcomes. But what we were lacking was an understanding of the drivers of perception that, that can influence prejudice. And so we were able to do some work looking across the whole of society, not on outcomes, but on people's values and attitudes. How did they perceive men and women in terms of their suitability for leadership? And what came out of that was basically in many ways a measure of prejudice against women in terms of their, the way they're perceived in terms of their suitability for leadership. So some of those early figures, we remember just 48% of the population of the G7 group feeling entirely comfortable with the idea of a woman as a country leader, and a very similar figure for the proportion of society that felt entirely comfortable with the idea of a woman as a CEO of a large national organisation. And we know that that prejudice against female leadership was held by women as well, but in every country where we've done the research, much more so by men. So our job has been to start to measure and track this so that we can understand what interventions could be working. Now, of course, COVID brings new issues to this. We know already the early findings around an increase in domestic violence, around the imbalance of the impact of childcare during lockdown. Obviously, as we go towards releasing the figures for this year for the Reykjavik Index, it will give us an opportunity to understand whether or not there have been significant changes this year, or whether actually the drivers of prejudice that shape those everyday conversations around the way men and women view themselves, whether those drivers have continued in the same way.
And Michelle, just quickly a follow-up question. You do this index, like you do a regular update every year. And why does that matter? Why is it important to measure every year? Don't kind of value stereotypes take much, much longer to get to change?
So cultural norms in society can stay the same for 10 years, or you can also see sometimes very rapid changes over a short period of time. But what we do know is that evidence in the form of time series becomes more and more valuable to us the longer we track things, because we start to be able to see correlations with things that may have happened to shape that. So this is still very early days for the Reykjavik Index. We had the 2018 data, 2019 data, and now we're coming back this year. We saw last year some change in the UK from having been at the top of the index. So therefore the degree of prejudice against women in leadership in the UK being lower than anywhere else. That doesn't mean it wasn't there though. Then we saw that shift last year and deteriorate. So this year we'll see whether or not that was a one-off or perhaps just a blip. So I think with all evidence bases, the longer over time that you can track them, the more major events like COVID and the impact of them can be understood in that data series.
So an event, a big global implication of COVID-19 might have a measurable impact then. So we look forward to the data this year. Let me move on to our next speaker, and it's very difficult to not use up all our time for just mentioning all the accomplishments that Dr. Obi Ezekwesili has had in her life. She is now the Senior Economic Advisor to the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative, but she is the former Vice President of the World Bank, a co-founder of Transparency International, a co-founder of the Bring Back Our Girls movement, former Federal Minister of Solid Minerals, and also later the Federal Minister of Education of Nigeria, and also indeed a presidential candidate in Nigeria. And Dr. Obi, we're absolutely thrilled to have you here and hear your thoughts. And let me just ask you very straightforward, because COVID-19 has really highlighted that there's a big need for more women in leadership. Those countries that had women as leaders did relatively better, but 93% of the world's countries are still led by men. So just imagine a world where it's 50-50, 50% of all countries led by women. So what can we do, and how can we disrupt that notion that women might not be strong leaders? How can we show that the opposite is the case from your personal experience, but also from your overarching views?
Yes, thank you so much, Silvana. And hello, everyone, my co-panelists. What a pleasure. I think that, the first important thing that I believe we must use in this conversation is what, my co-panelists, Ms. Harrison just talked about. I think that we need to put analytical evidence, empirical evidence. We need to use as much data mining as possible in order to tell the story of the criticality of the agenda that we're pursuing. I believe that by now we should be done, trying to persuade people on the basis of what we think is right to do. We should really show them that when, you are faced up with the evidence of how better our world will be represented in terms of the critical development issues that we need to solve by the participation of women, the logical reference would make the argument more valid. I therefore believe that we haven't mined sufficient data. We don't even know as much as we should in terms of the results that women who have led, whether at the local levels or in corporate world or in state institutions, have produced in order to then do this kind of argumentation that is absolutely necessary. The only reason that we are able to catch the world's attention on presidents that have managed the COVID pandemic in their countries better than their male counterparts is because the whole world was watching and paying attention. And the results were very obvious. But there are many other results that have been produced by women leaders that have not in any way been consciously studied, understood, and evidence of the difference that it made in the progress that our global world needs to make as showcased. We have to invest in this. We also have to invest in the numbers from the side of the demand side of such leadership. The demand side of such leadership is that we've got to invest in knowing the voter demographics as far as it concerns women. We have democracy. In democracy, you don't beg your way into office. You basically use everything that you've got in order to get what you want to get. And I believe that we've got numbers in terms of women as voters. But what have we done in understanding that whole, big piece of voter participation in democracies, in elections, in fact, post-election matters? What have we done in understanding that? And then joining up in building the kinds of viable coalitions that male candidates must, without a doubt, take note of, and political parties will be conscious of. We were thinking that some messiah of a leader is going to think that we need women. Therefore, okay, we're going to give you some token. No, we're past that. We shouldn't be making these arguments on a soapy, sentimental basis. We should use our numbers in a better way. And I think that the necessary investment in generating these numbers is something that's missing. We talk about it, but I haven't seen an effort toward really doing this. In my country today, as we discuss as women, it's one of the areas that we want to invest in. Some offices, some local political offices get voted in by as less a number as 20,000 people voting for the winner. And yet we would have like 300,000 women who are in that same community. Imagine, if I want more women in political office, I should be interested in the fact that I've got 300,000 women sitting in a place where a man went into the office with 20,000 votes. We have to do these things in a more strategic way, in a way that analysis guides our action and empirical evidence gives us the basis to say to society, this is what you miss. I mean, imagine that we had the leadership of our friend in New Zealand, of our friend in Germany, of our friend in Taiwan, in all the adjoining countries of their continent. I mean, look at what the evidence would do. In fact, one of the things that we should probably do is to use the results they produced in managing the COVID and modeling it across the world to show us how differently the COVID outcome would have been. Perhaps this is something that the Women Political Leadership Forum we can think of. Just take the results they produced, and because today's algorithms can help us to imagine that, this were the situation in these other countries where we have the highest incidence of poor management, what would the outcome be? That could be part of the way we really use this to move in the direction of having more female leaders doing things and producing results. So my final conclusion is, hey, we've got plenty of results that we're not showcasing. And then we've got plenty of gaps that we need to show that if we put the same kinds of skills and attitude of leadership too, competencies and attitude of leadership on the part of women too, we would produce higher order results than what we currently are getting. I just hope I haven't overspoken.
Well, thank you so much, Obi, very much for this very, very concrete and actionable suggestion of what we all should do in our discourses when trying to when we make the point of how the world can change if there are more women as leaders, and that this is like that the data of especially on a topic that we all watch the news on every day is extremely relevant and easy to be understood and easy to digest. So thank you very much for making this point so strongly. And this brings me over to our friend Atsushi Sunami, Professor Atsushi Sunami, who of course is the president of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, also a longtime advisor to the Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who coined the term womenomics, and also an adjunct professor of science and technology policy at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. Atsushi, you have the pleasure of being the man in this discussion forum. So you can speak now, you have the opportunity to speak for half the population of the world, for men. No, but joking aside, what of course is quite perplexing, and we'd love to hear your view on this, is that around the world, one can see that most of the ministers for gender equality or parliamentarians who sit in committees that deal with equality between women and men are women. And it seems like that's not only male, but also female leaders, but more so male leaders still consider this policy area a women's issue. Why is that, in your view?
Well, thank you, Silvana. I'm not sure whether I can speak on the half of the population, but I had a privilege last year co-hosting the WPL summit, first time in our part of the world, in Asia, which led to the Japan's hosting of G20 summit, which have actually discussed the importance of a woman's political leadership in solving many of our common agenda that we are facing together. But I would think that but it is very important for a male to have the kind of lifestyle that is really being a sort of sharing of with a female in a way of really not to distinguish by different sexes. In other words, we have been starting this the child care leave for most male, even in Japan now that we are forcing. This is going to be a very important policy, because I believe that having an experience of raising child as a part of the sort of happiness, that it's nothing to do with being father or just being mother, but as a parent, together watching your child growing up and the kind of enjoying or sharing this experience gives you in a way that equality has nothing to do, actually just male talking about how to raise or create an environment for female to just be equal in a woman's issue. But this is our part of life. This is what we are very cherishing together, to have a kind of a common happiness sort of being experienced with the female. I think this is something that was very important to learn, to have more opportunities to actually experience this kind of feeling. I mean, this kind of life experience. And I think by doing that, I think it would really change some of the fundamental sort of views of the male talking about this woman equality issue. And of course, you know, UN, I think, started this He for She movement in 2014, I believe. But this is a very important movement. And we have a chance now to talk about seriously about sort of gender equality issues from male point of view. But I think not just sort of leaders talking about the importance of the issue, but to have the more broader educational opportunity for male to share the same kind of life experience with women, and to have the sort of say this is not just a gender equality issue. This is something us together should cherish, to enjoy, to have that share the happiness kind of working together. I mean, this educational, well, that's why I think this girls to lead female leaders, but it has to have boys involved at the early stage to really feel this is a part of us, not just we talking about the gender equality issue.
Thank you. And I mean, there is this saying, gender equality starts at home. That that's an absolutely crucial point. How do roles at home are displayed so that the children see that? But Atsushi, let me challenge you and take you one step further in a question. So how can we really mobilize male leaders to want to say, I make this a policy priority?
Right. Actually, COVID-19 actually had impacted on our lifestyle. And most of the us as a male are now working from at home. And we are now sharing a lot of daily work together with family. So this is a great opportunity for us to really find a new normal, as this is, you know, to really have the new work style for, especially my part of the world in Asia, where male is known to be working and don't really come back to home, you know, early every day. But we just had chosen our new prime minister, and I hope that he would continue and take this new normal as a kind of a new stepping platform to address very important policy issues with female perspectives. And I just, you know, having worked as an advisor to several female ministers in my government, I really learned a lot from their leadership in really shedding some of the lights that we often overlook in the male sort of political leaders, of women's health issue to a domestic violence issue, all these things that are happening even during the COVID. And these are very important issues. And we wanted to set that as a new normal for all of us to consider.
Thank you very much, Atsushi. And moving on to Elena Candon, who is a 15-year-old student in Brussels, Belgium, which of course is in Europe. I would like to also give you the opportunity, like Atsushi had the opportunity to speak for a male's view, that you can speak on from the point of view of the next generation of the youth of these days. Because as Michelle has pointed out, changing beliefs and changing behaviors, especially those that have been around for hundreds of years, is difficult. And it's not also a thing that happens from one day to the next. So how, Elena, in your view, can and already does your generation confront old and harmful stereotypes?
Well, for one thing, you have to take into consideration that it's an entirely different perspective. I mean, we grew up thinking, why don't more women instead of why can't women? So we look at it more like, so why is it not 50-50? Why is it still 1 to 99 ratio? And so this means that when we are politically active in youth movements, we educate ourselves differently on new topics because the problem has sort of been solved already by past generations. We try to advocate more that it should be more women in politics, more men in nursing. And we also grew up with an education where it promotes a lot of critical thinking. So unlike in the past, maybe, we get to try and think in a way that no one else sort of thinks. We get to think for ourselves, or at least that's what the aim is. We get to try to make our own decisions, and those decisions can lead to us deciding that I want to vote for this person because I like what they stand for, not because I think that that person is a man and therefore I will vote for him instead of her. Especially also in youth movements, there's less importance whether the leader is a woman or a girl. It's more about what they stand for, which is very important because in the future, when we get to vote and when we get to be active, properly active in politics and in everything, we can vote in a way that creates the sort of future that we want, which is an equal future. Something that still has to be changed about the idea of feminism is that it's not men versus women, it's men and women versus sexists, which I think once that's understood by more people, it will lead to a future which is a lot more equal, because when one sees a candidate who is a woman who is advocating for domestic abuse help, one will be less likely to think, oh, that's a women's issue. I'm more interested in climate change. They will start to think a bit more, hopefully, like that's not just a women's issue, that's an issue for everyone. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. And I see Atsushi really nodding because, like him, you made the point that it's very much a joint effort of women and men together, and that, like Atsushi was saying, that COVID-19 was in a way a wake-up call for many men to see what does domestic work really consist of and get a very new perspective on that part of life which was seen just as the woman's part. You make the point that many of the important questions of today's world are not a girl's or a boy's or men's or women's issue. It's something that needs to be jointly tackled. Same for the question of equality between women and men. And Elena, now you're here with several accomplished leaders from all parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, America. So what would you just, if they would have the possibility to just make one thing happen immediately, what would you ask established leaders to do? What would be a thing that you would say they should do?
Well, for one thing, doing what they do to influence, well, not influence might not be the right word, but to talk to adults or people their age isn't going to work on adolescents and children because it's obviously designed for adults. So you could use what you're using already on adults to explain that home life is super important and informing opinions on young people. So you could try to encourage parents to teach their children to be able to form their own opinions and not be influenced by what their parents think. That's one thing that you could try and ask people to do. Or, for example, if you want to explain something to someone who is young, like, for example, why it's important to vote for this party because let's say that they are very active in climate change, but it's not very obvious to younger people because they don't understand it. Social media is a great way to do that because that's how a lot of information is being processed by younger people these days, because most of the information is put into bite-size portions, meaning that they can properly process it, and that's just how the future of that's just going to be, I can't find the right word for it, but social media is one of the ways you can help teach younger people that equality is important.
Well, thank you so much, Elena. And I think we all agree that we can't wait until you grow up and be a politician yourself in one way or the other. But you know what you just described, Anna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, she did that in the management of the COVID-19 crisis in order to find out the right response for her government on how to explain to people what are the necessary means, but also to understand the impact, what it has on people. She met regularly with children and asked them and wanted their opinions, and did also special press conferences for children in the language that are possible to understand for children. And you, age 15, of course, are sort of between child and adolescent, if I can say that, are exactly putting this challenge to leaders who are very much used to speaking in terminology that might not be that easy to understand for all of those who are not exactly in that kind of job circle, not even difference in age groups. Thank you so much, Elena, for your views and your advice to the leaders here. And with that, I hand over to Gabriela Cuevas Barron, who is the president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, which is the world's organization representing the parliaments of the world. And Gabriela is also a member of the Senate of Mexico. And Mexico, of course, is an especially ambitious country when it comes to legislation on women in political leadership. Constitution and laws were changed so to achieve parity and in the political representation. And we now have this year the 25th anniversary of what is called the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. One of those terms, Elena, where you would say, well, who should understand what this is? But it was a big, big milestone in the fight for equality between women and men, and also was asking for this equitable access to leadership positions. So what would you say could be the main areas of actions for politicians in the next coming months to make sure that women get the space and the way forward to join male colleagues at these decision-making tables?
Thank you very much, Silvana, for this invitation. And you were speaking about the conference in Beijing 25 years ago, and perhaps, yes, Elena is going to think that this is like ancient history, but 25 years ago, it's just one generation. It's not that much. I started in politics when I was 15 years old, and I got elected to the federal parliament of my country when I was 21. So I think that part of the experience that I have had is because my country has an open legislation for women and for youth. And that's not, unfortunately, the reality in all the countries. If we go to data, which I believe is very important to be responsible leaders, well, 25 years ago, there were only 11% of women occupying the seats in parliament. And now, again, 25 years ago, well, the percentage is not that optimistic. What are we going to say to the girls as Elena? That we failed? That 25 years later, it is only 24.9%, that only 1 out of every 4 seats in a parliament is represented by a woman? That is not democratic. That is not inclusive. And of course, that is not representative. Or if we go one step further, more than half of the total world's population is under 30 years old. We have a young population. Well, but if we compare this percentage with the seats in parliament, young people under 30 years old are only having 2.2% of the seats in parliament. So we are taking decisions for women without women, and we're taking decisions for youth without youth. So we need to change the model. We need to understand that now politics are having new tools. We were talking, Elena mentioned that about social media. We are talking now about technology. Yes, the world is changing and it's changing super fast. And politics needs to be adapted to new realities. And this is a matter of leadership, which is actually the theme of this panel, which is the kind of leadership that we need for the post-COVID-19 recovery. We need leadership with values, democratic, of course, respectful on human rights, but we need more women taking the lead. And it is not only about percentage or quotas. It is because we care about a different agenda. It's because we have a different background. And it's because we can. Sometimes, and I must say, I was hearing this the first time that we discussed the gender quotas, the affirmative action in my own country, almost 20 years ago. There were some men saying like, come on, and what happens if a dumb woman is coming to the parliament? I don't remember a single IQ test to be applied to men. So I think that the criteria is about allowing women and men to compete in equal circumstances. Of course, there are very important problems, and I wanted to say like challenges, but no, there are real problems. And one of these problems is that we need to bring men also on board on changing first, of course, the institutional background. We need a new institutional design, and then we are going to be able to make cultural changes. But if we are not bringing men on board, we are going to continue seeing all violence against women that is increasing in many regions. We are going to see what happened with the pandemic. The moment that women need to be at home, the moment that they are being beaten, murdered by their own families. So there's a lot of things to do. And I think that we owe it not only to Elena's generation. This is something that we need to do for ourselves, and also to honor the memory of those women that were super brave. And now that we are getting elected and that we can vote, we have to honor their memory. Thank you very much, Silvana, for organizing this panel and for inviting me.
Thank you, Gabriela, for this extremely strong statements, and also the call for changing the system so that youth can actually find ways to speak for themselves. It's a very, very ambitious goal. We have a few minutes left, so I really unfortunately have to ask everybody to be super short, but I want to put the question to both Michelle and Atsushi about a phenomenon on the index, which shows that countries like Japan and Germany, highly industrialized countries, strong economies, very open for rational arguments that make sense from an economic point of view. Things like McKinsey, Credit Suisse, OECD recommend, meaning have more women as leaders. It's not happening in both of those countries. Any explanation? Very super short, if possible. Atsushi, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Well, you posed a very difficult question, and a short answer is not good enough to address that. I think But one thing I should say is that we need to find a new way of living with COVID-19, and the social transformation is absolutely necessary in order for all of us to survive. And in order to create that, the woman leadership is absolutely necessary. As Gabriela mentioned, all these things that are happening as a very important political issues, and male is just not the right way to approach or to answer these questions. And I think not only equal participation, but the woman leadership in really finding us a way to find a new way of a sustainable life with and after COVID. So we cannot lose this momentum, and I think that WPO should lead this.
Thank you, Atsushi. Michelle, from a data point of view, what's your answer?
So Germany is something of a phenomenon. I think it goes back to a comment that Professor Sunami made earlier about issues of equality or inequality in the home. So what I would say, one of the things that's very important in the German data is there is one of the biggest gaps in that country across the G7 in comparison to other G7 countries in terms of the gap of perception between men and women. So what we think will be happening is those issues, the kinds of conversations around the kitchen table, the way in which prejudice drives and is driven by inequality in the way in which women are visible in corporate life or civic life, that's a very significant thing in Germany. And of course, what you and I have discussed many times, that is despite having a female head of country. So it is not that German women are not looking for change. There is a considerable difference there in attitudes.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Obi, Elena had been very strongly making the case for both the role of education, that this is crucial for boys and girls today, also asked leaders of today to encourage parents to have, so that boys and girls can have a voice and form opinions. Now, you as one of the leaders in the continent that you know best, Africa, where you were the vice president of the World Bank for Africa, but also as the Bring Back Our Girls movement, what would you say is the challenge that this transition is not happening fast enough, and how can COVID-19 accelerate that? We've got very few minutes left, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Sorry, I forgot that I am muted. So, okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. I do think that what COVID-19 presents my continent with is an opportunity for a complete reset. A reset of our philosophical underpinnings for economic development. Hitherto, it's been mostly almost an obsession for natural resources based economic development. And so it hasn't put as much emphasis on human capabilities as should happen. We know that many societies, that of Sunami, Atsushi Sunami as a very important example, it is about human capability. It's about what education does in advancing the human capital of a society without natural resources. And so if that transition happens as part of our post-COVID reset, what would happen is that when we present evidence that girls going to school improves the opportunities for the larger society, not just for the girls that go to school, that it improves the opportunities for the families and for communities, then we have a very important entry point for getting the continent to be much more calibrated and more deliberate in the way that emphasis on girls' education is given. And then my final thought is that, the more that we see how this disparity is leading to the dislocation of society, the more the conversation needs to also really get down to what is innate for me. A lot of the men are not seeing this argument from the perspective of what is innate for them. We need to fashion an argument that helps the men see what's innate for them. And I think that a lot of our data and storytelling approach needs to get to that place where the personal incentive for fathers, for corporate leaders, for national leaders to want to push the agenda with us would then, really find much more steam and impetus.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Obi. We have reached the time limit. It was an incredibly dynamic and insightful discussion, and we've got very strong takeaways from making youth access to policy, making clear what's in it for everybody, for men, for boys, for women. We've got the need for data, and we've got views from all over the world and generations and gender across. So thank you so very much for this discussion and your contributions. And dear audience, I hope there were things for you to find interesting and to take further and channel more of those kind of discussions so that we all are in it together for changing the stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Silvana, thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.